Yes, thanks, Eric. It's my pleasure, for the invitation to give this keynote speech at the ICAE conference, which is unfortunately virtual this year. I just said I used to attend the conference a couple of times, and it was always very, very inspiring and very nice to be in an interdisciplinary and integrated community, as our Eon Energy Research Center is an example. How engineers and natural scientists and economists can work together to find answers to desperately needed questions. Now here you see a nice picture that we should turn from gray to green. In Germany, this is called Energiewende. I translated with sustainable energy transition, and that will be my starting point. So here is the outline of my talk. I will start with a few slides why the energy transition is needed and how big the task is. And then I will address some new paradigm emerging, which is called energy system integration, ESI. And in particular, I will address or focus on an article that was published recently by two of my colleagues in the Energy Journal. It's Jamasp and Llorca. And then I'll go through some challenges with regard to increasing shares of variable or volatile renewable energy sources. And I'll address some flexibility options and my way of looking at this in terms of a so-called merit order, which I have not found yet and which I have not managed to develop myself yet, but I'll show you and discuss with you what I mean with that. And the last 2 or 3 slides are then about the role of information and communication technology and the potential for new business models and how that also shapes our world and the future energy systems. So it's not just technology, that's a main point I will make, but there is also people, there is business models and many actors, including policymakers and regulators, that will have to play a role to make the sustainable energy transition really sustainable. The sustainability goals, I think you're all familiar with the 3 or 4 pillars of sustainability, but here you see 4 different pillars. They have been called the 4 Ds. Decarbonization, that is the ultimate driver of policy making to decarbonize the entire system and you know, our human energy supply systems by 2050, ideally, to mitigate global warming to a level that can still be managed. 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think that is almost gone. 2 degrees Celsius is still within reach, but the clock is running. Decentralization is more like a technological driver, and some people would see a need for organizing their energy supply in a more distributed, in a more localized way. This can be communities, this can be prosumer households, and so forth. And digitalization, of course, enables much of this. So we all don't know what digitalization will bring to us in the next 10, 20, 30 years. The development is extremely dynamic and hard to foresee, including now cryptocurrencies and many other solutions, or the smart grids, etc., etc. I see it always as an economist and a policy advisor, in the sense that there are huge investment needs. So unless the capital is available for all these investments and somebody needs to pay the bill in the end, then maybe some of these potentials are overplayed. And the 4th pillar here is democratization. With more localized distributed systems, also the power moves to the people, in the sense that it's no longer a top-down planned system with a few actors, but there might be millions of decision makers. And with millions, I mean not just humans, but also the agents that are serving the humans, agent-based modeling. These are pieces of software that are supposed to make our life easier. But I'm kind of a devil's advocate, and I would also call this a curse, not just a blessing, to have more and more complex systems. And the 5th D has also been named in the literature. That's diversification. And that's not just technological diversity, but also in terms of more and more heterogeneous systems and solutions, and more actors that differ from each other. I think this is another curse of complexity, the modeling all this diversification and the proper understanding in terms of shaping the world towards sustainability. Now, it's not a surprise that energy, the energy system, supply and demand are the main responsible for the global warming. Here you see the greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons, and you see the share of energy and the trend in contrast to, say, agriculture or waste or land use change in forestry. So that's substantial. So it's in a way also our responsibility as energy researchers to provide some of the solutions to decarbonize our world. This is a picture of Germany, and the mountain in China is much larger. And I'm Austrian, by the way, living in Switzerland. I know what I talk about when I talk about mountains. This is the historical mountain from the 1950s into fossil fuel, into nuclear power. And many would say, no, we need to get rid of nuclear and fossil fuels. And you can see the plans of the German governments to decarbonize, but also to phase out nuclear. That's this pink color at the bottom. On top of that is lignite and hard coal. And so you can understand that this is a massive, massive challenge to decarbonize and denuclearize in 20, 30 years' time, and then also to fill the gap. Now, with renewables, we would all like to see more and more renewables, but this raises a lot of issues and system integration costs of an unprecedented scale. The dirty man of Europe, I think this was Great Britain in the 19th century. But if you look at the decarbonization planned in Europe, this is a group of European countries who have declared the decarbonization in terms of the coal phase out compared to the German declared phase out. This was policy that was put into force end of last year. And by 2038, ideally 2035, the coal phase out should have been accomplished. This will cost several billions of euros. So it's quite costly to get rid of something that maybe we should not have let to be there for such a long time. Now, Germany is one of the leading countries, one of the richest countries, and leading in terms of renewable energy technology diffusion. Yeah, the shares of renewables, this is now about electricity generation. I think the slide is a bit outdated. I didn't have much time to look for a more recent one, but some countries you can see have certain shares of renewables. The shares are growing over time and the challenges are growing with that as well. Just to pick out Germany, I think earlier this year, there was an announcement that by now about 56% of the electricity supply comes from renewables on a balanced basis. 56, here it looks more like 18, so I don't know what's wrong with the slide, but anyway, it's just an illustration that there are different shares of renewables and different challenges of integrating those. This is an alternative slide that also shows you the dynamics on a more worldwide basis. You see the large countries, China, India, US, the European Union, and the rest of the world or the world overall. This is dynamics that needs to be properly managed and handled, and this should go in the right direction, right? So it's a policy responsibility. There are needs for re-regulation, and of course, a lot of technological and economic and social questions that need to be addressed. Now, many of my colleagues would say, yeah, the future will be all electric. No? When I speak to other colleagues, they say, no, there will be a lot of hydrogen. We are going towards the hydrogen economy. So who is right, who is wrong? Will we just see some mix, and what mix in particular? There is so much out there that we need to properly understand and properly model. Now, the energy trilemma is something most of you will also be familiar with, between affordability, energy security, and environmental sustainability. Last year, I gave a keynote speech at an IAEE conference. And out of that is the book chapter where you see the reference at the bottom of this slide. So feel free to get a copy of the chapter because it covers much of what I cannot talk about here due to the lack of time. But anyway, the energy trilemma corners have been redefined over the years many times. And you find in the literature many variants of it. This is just another one that I picked in my book chapter. And justice. has entered the discussion more and more, and also fuel or energy poverty. Here also you see finance as an important aspect. This can be attributed to economics in a wider sense. And when it comes to environment, of course, climate change mitigation should not be missing in that corner either. So this is one way of operationalizing policy goals and policy trade-offs, but the corners, as I said, have been defined in many different ways. Energy efficiency and rebound plays a role. That is part of the solution, but rebound also has an important role, and we should properly understand the rebound problem and not just advocate energy efficiency, ignoring rebound. Energy finance capital needs on a worldwide basis. We just did a study in my group recently to quantify the financing needs for achieving the renewable energy goals worldwide. Energy, fuel, poverty, justice are issues in a globalized world. That means you cannot just take your national boundaries and then say, yeah, our country needs to be fuel just, or we should mitigate fuel poverty. No, it's a globalized world, or call it localized, global and localized at the same time. We have responsibilities that go beyond the national borders, also in terms of our system development and in the assessment of the implications of what we do. It's not national boundaries that are the right boundaries to be drawn. And that also makes the analysis, the modeling more and more challenging. Now, I'm a modeler, so I always think about the models that we need, and the curse of dimensionality, the curse of complexity is increasingly an issue. I have colleagues specializing in reducing the complexity of their models to make them still useful, because they're so complex that the running times are just excessive, and that makes the models less and less useful. But on the other hand, with sector coupling, the complexity naturally rises as more and more systems that were separated traditionally and could be analyzed in a separate way are now growing together in some ways that are hard to understand, because it's not a planned system anymore to a large extent, but it's an evolving system. And in liberalized countries, in democratic countries, this is all the more of a problem, so to speak, because it's hard to tame the citizens' needs and wants, which are not always in a sustainable development direction. Now, this ESI by Jamasp and Llorca, briefly summarized, we need to take a whole system perspective, as I have already argued, and that allows us also to achieve and exploit some synergies. Again, in a monopolistic energy supply system, there was a lot of vertical integration, often horizontal integration, and with the neoliberal way of thinking and policy making, there was a lot of unbundling. And so many of the synergies could no longer be exploited because unbundling was seen as being more beneficial, in the sense that it would introduce more competition. Competition is good, it brings down prices, it spurs innovation and so on. But with a more and more integrated energy system, we also need to rethink and reconsider the synergy potentials and to check whether the balance is still right between unbundling and synergy exploitation. There is an aspiration here for balancing energy security with sustainability and equity, and we want to do that, of course, effectively and in a cost-efficient manner. And in the light of this rapidly evolving complex system and democratization and the massive investment needs, possible instabilities and crises, how many of you have anticipated the COVID-19 crisis? Somebody recently talked about the MERS crisis in a couple of years. So let's hope we get out of this and not into the next pandemic soon. It just slows us down tremendously, also in terms of sustainable energy transition. Yeah, we need not just physical, technical solutions, but also understand and develop economic models and the regulation needed, the policy frameworks for a sustainable and efficient performance of our systems over time. And with systems, I do not only mean the energy systems, but you could imagine that more and more companies become multi-business utilities, and they might engage in energy, water, and IT services. Now, services, it's the services that we want, not the products or the commodities. I don't buy oil or gas or electricity because I like the commodity. No, I like the services that I can realize with those commodities and products. ESI has been described as a network of networks, so encompassing a so-called multi-vector energy system. So a vector of energy systems, that means to bring energy from certain places, across a certain time in a certain way to where it is needed. I think that's one definition you find in the literature. Each network industry consists vertically integrated activities, the classical production, transmission, distribution, retailing chains, but a better system integration through vertical separation of the energy industry and the transition to more communication between distribution systems and distribution system operators could also reap a lot of potentials, especially in a more and more integrated world. Here is a graph. I think there are thousands of graphs like this. The technical supply system is complicated. There are more and more technologies, including distributed ones. These can be connected in many, many different ways. And so that's one landscape. It's a map that helps us to orientate ourselves and to see where are the issues and how can we model and integrate further. I'm not going to discuss this slide in all details, but it covers quite many of the fields that you might probably be specialists in. And so it helps also to have some interdisciplinary discussions. Now, let's turn back to regulation. There are many barriers when it comes to regulatory adjustments. For example, market entry barriers. When there are new actors with new business models, we should enable then market entry, but then they also have some destructive potential. Schumpeter called it the creative destruction of innovators. I would call Elon Musk as a nice example of one of those creative destructors. And without or with high market entry barriers, innovation would be slowed down. Standardization likewise, and of course consumer protection, especially when you have conservative regulators, could also be an important barrier to new regulation. And some of these regulatory models need to be redefined and reconsidered as well. There is some term called the multi-business regulation. Now, for the balancing of variable renewables and how to integrate higher and higher shares, we need a lot of flexibility options. And that's the third aspect I want to address, the challenges regarding integration. This is a slide, and much discussion so far has been on power systems. But I think we all know that we need a heat energy transition and a transportation transition as well. So it's not just the electric system, even though some would say the electric system becomes more and more important in combination with ICT. These are two sisters, and some of my colleagues now have that are electrical engineers. Their faculties have often been renamed into electrical engineering and ICT or something similar. Now, quality, balancing, stability, and flow are four dimensions along which we can address the dangers to the system. We don't want flickering. We don't have local voltage excursions or deviations. We don't want brownouts, blackouts more than is needed. Harmonic distortions that could endanger some of the devices and so on. Then we have balancing. We all know electricity needs to be balanced in any moment in time for the stable operation and so forth. I'm not going through all these bullet points. It's just one of those slides reflecting the challenges there are. What we would like is some kind of cost minimization versus the maximum integration of renewables. It is an issue that I will discuss, the so-called curtailment of renewables. And let me wait for a minute to address that aspect. Here you see also the minimization of vertical energy interchange. Vertical integration has often some danger of leading to market power. or too much market power. And so competition is also highly desirable. And when we only deal with cost minimization, then this usually neglects the revenue side or the market side. It's not just a cost minimization exercise, but more. It's more profit maximization if we deal with profit maximizing actors. Now here's a list. I think it's a bit useful because it has 4 main categories. Flexibility options can be seen as demand side, like classical demand response or the old-fashioned demand side management. I think in the literature there's some distinction that demand response is typically more associated with tariffs. Demand side management could be more the engineering solutions, but I might also be wrong on that. Then supply side flexibility options. I will discuss curtailment in a moment, but also one slide on the enhancement of the flexibility of conventional power generation units. Then we have some network flexibility options, like smart grids or network expansion, better network interconnections. In Europe, we have a lot of additional connectors to United Kingdom and to Scandinavia, and particularly Norway. Microgrids with or without islanding, and so forth. And some others, and under others you see storage. Maybe storage is too big a topic to put it under other, but this is not my classification. I took it from the literature, and all the references are, by the way, at the end of the presentation for you to look up if you like. This is another slide. There's thousands of those, but it's nice to see where grid side flexibility comes in, where we see supply side flexibility and demand side flexibility options. And when we talk about prosumer households, the households that to some extent self-generate the self-consumed energy, that's my definition of a prosumer, then this is kind of a hybrid entity. Where, you have supply, demand, and storage at the same time in some combinations. Demand side management, demand response, that's a classic, comes in different forms. You can try to cap the peaks of demand. You can fill the valleys to avoid peak power generation needs and to have a more smooth load curve. You can shift the load. You can try to conserve some energy. I know energy conservation is a misnomer in terms of the thermodynamic laws. Let's call it energy saving. And this is, again, not my classification. I took it from the literature. Load growth or flexible load shapes. Here is the economic side with incentives and also the duck curve. Some of you might have seen or heard about the duck curve. This is a nice way to illustrate how elasticity plays a role. You can see the load shape before demand response is being introduced. And then here there are some elasticities of demand assumed. And depending on the elasticity, you can shape the curve more or less. And the measures to be taken also have some costs, costs and benefits. That's the economics world, to do some cost benefit analysis. Here, typically in a dynamic way, not just a static analysis, and often covering many different alternatives to do the trick, in this case, to shape the curve. Time of use tariffs has been a classical way. It has played an important role for a long time, but usually this is very static and therefore unable to adapt to increasing shares of variable renewable energy sources. And dynamic pricing seems to be more beneficial because here is the price signal that is supposed to dynamically adjust consumer behavior or the load curve in light of scarcities. So also scarcity of, say, conventional power supply. If there is a low renewable output, then you need more conventional power generation. And one alternative would be demand response. With dynamic prices, you can do that. Now, this has been in place, but now we can view it from the viewpoint of more and more variable renewables as well. Now, grid expansion is a special field on its own. This is a map of Germany. It has a strong need to bring the offshore wind power to the south of the country. And social acceptance is a big issue here because it has been terribly difficult to build new power lines. People just don't like it. It's NIMBYism. In some of the federal states, the operators were forced to dig the power lines underground, which cost them several times more than overhead lines and so forth. So this is just one of the flexibility options there are. And this is often discussed mainly on the transmission operation level, but we all know the smart distribution grid is where the needs are more and more challenging. There might even be more money to be spent to make the distribution grid smarter and smarter. That's more the localized or regional level rather than the inter-regional and international level. But anyway, this is a flexibility option that has a certain role to play. It can be discussed what the future of the transmission grid will be in light of more and more localized, decentralized, and democratized systems, and the tariffs that need to be paid for maintaining this huge system. But anyway, it's one of those. Storage, this slide unfortunately is in German, but I just want to make the point there are different storage technologies, and they have different dynamics and different parameters in terms of capacity and how fast you can charge and discharge them. And it just tells us, yeah, there are a lot of low capacity technologies, whereas the larger scale technologies are by and large pumped hydro storage, which is often at the limit of the potential already or the little remaining potentials in many places, including Switzerland and Austria or Germany. And we have hydrogen, synthetic methane, synthetic fuels, but there is still a lot to do to make them viable also commercially. So many storage options. Storage is another option. The next slides are from two studies that I would like to recommend to you. It's by Hans-Werner Sinn, a very famous German economist, and a group of economists at the German Economic Research Institute, DIW. There was a debate because Mr. Sinn, Professor Sinn, started with some back of the envelope calculations. In Germany, there's a lot of capacity in terms of wind power and solar power. So you see here, left-hand side, 35 gigawatts of wind power installation, and solar power was 37 gigawatts. Overall, that's the installed capacity needed in terms of the load in Germany, roughly speaking. But in terms of the average, it's just 5.8 and 3.7 gigawatts, the average availability. And if you look at the secured production, this is just a negligible quantity. So based on this observation, Professor Sinden started to calculate the storage needs. And he said, well, listen, this will be in the order of 10 terawatt hours for Germany to make sure that the wind and solar power can be stored and made available to the people and replace the conventional power generation. Then he also acknowledged that combining wind and solar, you know, they have complementary characteristics. This would at least reduce the storage needs to some extent. Well, then the other group of economists came and said, well, maybe he made some mistakes in his way of thinking. And here is a slide that I like. It's a review slide from different studies where you can see the share of variable renewables on the x-axis, and you can see the storage power capacity requirements in percentage terms. Of course, with more and more renewables, variable renewables, you need more and more storage capacity. This can be a challenge, this can be very expensive, and we can discuss which storage technologies do we talk about and who has the control over them. And then the other group of researchers opposing Sinn's views came up with the load duration curve and said, yes, in Germany, we have a situation where in some hours there is a terribly oversupply from renewables. That's where we have a negative residual load. That's on the right-hand side of this graph. And then they suggest to curtail a certain percentage of the excess renewable electricity, to curtail it, to throw it away. Some part should then be stored for use when there is no sunshine or no wind, and then still some part will be supplied by conventional power generation. Maybe in the future also some synthetic fuel power plants. That's the C area. B is the battery area, A and B, sorry. So you shift the load from A to B, and some part will be supplied by conventional generation units, and D will be the curtailment. In terms of the maximum renewable curtailment, we can discuss should we curtail 2, 10, 20 or 30%, But you can see how rapidly the storage needs go down if you allow more curtailment. This is in terms of power, by the way. The next slide is in terms of energy. This is even more dramatic. And we can discuss which curtailment is the more relevant one. So I like those two studies because it tells you a lot about the problem here at hand. We also did a study published last year in Applied Energy, where we looked at the economics of enhanced flexibility of gas-fired power plant. This graph illustrates it. It's not from our study. It's just taken from some other source. But by higher ramping rates and also better part load operation, some of these conventional power plants can still be useful, can even be still profitable in a market where more and more variable renewables come in. So that's another flexibility option. And there are many more. I can't talk about those, but some of you might be specializing in just those. And on the right-hand top part, you see the combinations in terms of microgrids, virtual power plants, energy hubs, city quarters, and so on. We did a study on energy hubs recently. This is a nice concept to analyze how you can combine distributed resources in an optimal way, and the rest that you cannot supply yourself from the energy hub, you can take from the outside world in terms of electricity input or gas input. And with that, you supply the final users. So I think that's a nice flexibility option as well, but in a more integrated sense. Now, the next slide is about cost calculations on a system level. We know that integration of renewables has some system costs. For the grid operators in Germany, this used to be several billion euros, and we need to talk about that. How can that be internalized? How could the operators of renewables pay at least partly for that, to provide some incentive that they locate their plants at a place where it is more beneficial than elsewhere? We did some studies lately on wind power integration and looked not just at the siting, but also at the type of wind power technology. And then we found even low wind turbines have some benefit to the system, and that benefit should be avoided somehow. So if we do this kind of stacking and also include the flexibility costs and benefits, then you can calculate something like a system LCOE. And you can compare all the different flexibility options based on that. This is taken from an Agora study. That's a German think tank. And they did a study on Turkey. If you like the references at the end, but I like the way of thinking. Maybe we should analyze all the storage technologies along this way to check their flexibility costs and benefits in light of an increasing share of variable renewables, and then take the decision about which storage technologies and other flexibility technologies to use and to foster, to spend R&D funding, research and development funding. Also from that study is a comparison here in terms of the costs versus the benefits, x-axis versus y-axis. And you can see on the very left side, you see demand response at the bottom, and a little bit higher, you see pumped storage hydro. This is on the break-even line where the costs just equal the benefits. On the right-hand side, all these storage technologies, some acronyms I didn't manage to find out. I think the valve-regulated lead-acid battery was one I figured out. Compressed air, you can see there, a lot of lithium-ion technologies, redox flow, and so forth. So many have a long way to go to make it to the break-even line, and then we can discuss flexibility options that apparently are breaking even between the costs and the benefits, or could be net beneficial. They also did an analysis for the projection to 2030, and now the dots are moving to the right, to the left, towards or across the break-even line. But look up the details for yourself. I just wanted to point out the way of thinking. Now, finally, a few slides about ICT and business models. I think we're all aware that information and communication technology is a game changer. It's an enabler for many new systems and many new business models. Distributed generation and demand response will be tremendously important once it can be integrated with the help of ICT and at low cost. So ICT is also crucial for smart energy grids and the ESI And information can also be of value to many other actors, such as aggregators who make that as their business model, but also for policy guidance. So it's just the issue, how do we develop this diffusion of ICT? How do we manage the system, and who says this is all going to be cost effective and also reliable and resilient? We need a resilient electricity or energy supply system overall, and a resilient ICT system that helps us to govern it. In terms of ICT infrastructure, you can see that like a spider in the web, orchestrating the other satellites that you see here in the graph. And so there are pros and cons of doing this. And there might be even some optimal speed of doing it. Not going further into that, final slide on that is the new business models and multi-business utilities that, as I said, might be an issue that pops up again. This article where I draw from by Jamasp and Liorca discussed this in detail, why we should look into synergy potentials from integrated businesses and also increasingly horizontally integrated businesses, not just the traditional vertical integration, as I pointed out earlier. And this is the final slide before the summaries. I think I still have then a few minutes saved for questions and answers. I like this slide because it shows some market-based methods versus control-based methods. Now, some of you might be more specializing in virtual power plants or in artificial intelligence and machine learning and so forth, whereas others, like economists, are more interested in the markets. And here you see new concepts like local flexibility markets, local energy markets. At some point we called it the energy eBay, that you just trade and sell like you do on eBay or some other on other platforms. And in this case, it would be energy services. This could all be enabled by ICT and made easy by actors facilitating it for the rather less well-trained private households, for example. It needs to be reasonably simple and safe at the same time. And then we might all want to be part of the game. Now, to summarize what I talked about, the sustainable energy transition is an enormous challenge. It implies a tremendous transformation of the energy system, but not just the energy system, also everything else, the regulatory framework, society will change, and so on. And there are lots of uncertainties. I introduced the 4 or 5 Ds, and that also needs to be mastered from a policy and regulatory perspective. There are rapidly rising shares of renewables in many places. It requires solutions and discussions about flexibility, merit orders very soon. And for cost efficiency, flexibility options should be brought in some kind of merit order. That is ascending curve of the options with some potential and some specific costs. And that's all but easy to do in practice. Smart grid technologies enable bottom-up and autonomous systems. And yeah, as I said, hopefully they support resilience rather than jeopardize it. And hopefully also serving for better energy justice and system friendliness and so on. But this all needs to be kept in mind when we develop new partial solutions. I discussed briefly value stacking, value pooling. So there is still a lot to do to understand the value stacking. Sometimes there might be a cool solution, but it doesn't pay off on its own. So you need to address the value components that might arise for different actors and how you can bundle those to make it overall worthwhile to go for it. And then sector coupling and the growing heterogeneity make life very challenging for the modelers, as I said, but also for policymakers. It's some curse of complexity that is all the time on my mind. We can discuss that issue if you like. And finally, there is a need for technically and economically and socially efficient energy system integration. Thanks, that's all I had. Happy to.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for a very interesting presentation here. And I got one question here from the chat from Professor Yin Yen here, the chairman. about if there is a tipping point of storage when we are coming to the position where we need more storage. And then I can complement with one that I had. Do you see if there is a tipping point for investments? We have a lot of pension funds and other actors who are investing a lot of money. And can you see there is a tipping point also for that perspective, that after a certain time period, no one wants to invest in fossil fuels. Everyone is only wanting renewables. So there were two questions, but about tipping points, both of them.
Well, I see the world evolving. So there's a continuous development, as I showed on many slides, and it's hard to predict whether there will be a tipping point, maybe some crisis. Like many think, COVID-19 will change the world dramatically. Now, I'm less optimistic about that everything will turn to the better, or that we have gained sometimes in terms of climate mitigation. I see it more evolutionary. And because storage is just one of many options, this will be a combination of things. The topic unburned carbon has been discussed a few years ago, whether it suddenly becomes not economically viable anymore to invest in, say, refineries or the upstream business for oil and gas and maybe coal. That is an issue. It has to do with shifting capitals, as has been said, from pension funds and large investors, that they suddenly decide not to invest in those fossil industries anymore, and that they start lacking capital. But don't forget, that's economic thinking. If we do the transition, then less and less oil and gas will be demanded eventually. And if there is lower demand, the prices also tend to go down. So even if the price goes up by getting not so much capital anymore, so the capital raising costs might go up for oil and gas industries, they would benefit from a lower demand, because more and more people would demand other energy sources rather than oil and gas. And of course, nobody knows that when we have a radical innovation. Once I chaired a session, and I think it was one of the ICAE conferences, when the inventor of the lithium-ion battery was on the panel. I'm still so happy I had the pleasure and honor to chair that session. And he just explained how his boss said to him, why don't you develop a lithium-ion battery with a much better performance than any other batteries we had before? And he just went and did it. Nowadays, we see more gradual innovation, as I see it, and also my battery experts among my colleagues would say that. It's more gradual at the moment, but we don't know when the next radical innovation will come, and that could be a game changer.
Yes. If we look at all those, you're economists, so you have a lot of things about that. I was just hearing on the radio today here, they were talking about in Germany, you have had a competition. So the Swedish company Vattenfall, they would close only 5-year-old coal-fired power plant in Hamburg with they're using 1,200 ton per hour of coal, and it is not economical advantages to keep it, even if it's only 5 years old. And 80% of all the coal-fired power plants, I think it was in the world, or if it was in Europe, are uneconomically. They are losing money. Do you have any comments?
China, for example, could learn a lot from the German experience. And there is not just 5-year-old coal power plants. There was one gas-fired power plant, a brand new, and it was the E.ON company, and they advertised it as the most energy efficient gas-fired power plant in the world. But it never made any money. So either they did very bad modeling or decision making, or the environment was so uncertain, so difficult to do the right decision. We developed an optimal model, a model for the optimal timing of disinvestment of a brand new gas-fired power plant. Just imagine. And there's another coal-fired power plant in Germany that just went online, but it took more than 12 years to get it online. And the reason was public opposition. And again, they advertised it as the most energy efficient coal-fired power plant at that time. And so they brought the 12-year-old now that never produced a kilowatt hour before, they brought it online now. And the reason was to avoid some damage compensation payments.
Yeah. No,
as you said, if some power plants are just phased out because they're no longer economical, then it doesn't make much sense to give those operators billions of euros as a compensation for phasing out coal. The market probably would have done the job, provided the CO2 prices are high enough.
Yeah, very interesting message from the experience from Germany. It was just a few months ago, I saw some news. China is planned to have 250 gigawatt under construction or planned installation for the coal-fired plant. Of course, this, but recently, you know, 1 or 2 months ago, they set up this new carbon neutral target in 2016. Yeah. So this might be some kind of conflict. I don't know what's the situation right now. It could be, I just think a similar way. So such like 250 gigawatt new capacity, is that going to be like 5 years or a short time life, the installation? That could be like really have a new discussion.
It's definitely a legacy to get rid of those investments that are not sustainable in the longer run. We all know we have to decarbonize, and if China or any other major region or country does not do the decarbonization, we will just lose the battle against global warming. And we did some analysis on carbon capture and storage retrofitting. Now, when China built 2 coal-fired power plants every week, they were all without carbon capture and storage. And then we did an analysis that showed it might not be economically viable to retrofit those power plants with CCS. You might prefer to demolish it and build a CCS plant instead, economically speaking. That was quite a surprising result.
Yeah, that's also, we get keynotes yesterday talking about.
As I see the Chinese development, when China grew at a double-digit growth rate, GDP growth, they just built all they could build. So there was renewables as well as coal and gas and everything. And now they try to shift the mix towards renewables and more sustainability. It's a tremendous challenge. And maybe one final comment. In China, I see it very positive that the country is partly running on a plan, on a 5-year plan. That makes decision-making often much more easy than in a country like Germany. Germany wants to be the leader in green development, but they are so struggling with the social inacceptance issues and long and complicated policy processes. And we just don't have the time in some sense to go through those lengthy processes because global warming tells us the time frame that we have left.
What do you say about this nuclear business? When we saw, there was a presentation in the morning here from a Chinese professor, and he was including nuclear power in the renewable energy field. In Germany, we're seeing nuclear power as being as bad as coal in many ways, and you're trying to close a lot of nuclear power instead. What do you say about that?
It was interesting that Germany decided to phase out nuclear much earlier in 2011 when Fukushima happened than coal. So that is not logical from a greenhouse gas mitigation perspective, but I think they just thought now the people will accept if we phase out nuclear. And just 1 or 2 years earlier before Fukushima, they actually prolonged the lifetime permissions, the running permissions for the nuclear power plants. So for the industry, it was very bad news to learn after the political decision to prolong the duration to phase them out in a relatively short time period, which is why the energy companies again sued the government. So it's taxpayers who will pay several billion euros for this premature phase out of nuclear. Now, nuclear is controversial in the sense many people don't like the idea of having a nuclear power plant in the neighborhood or having to deal with nuclear waste disposal. But we all know it's a very low CO2 technology. And the issue of combining renewables with nuclear is a challenge because nuclear power did not used to be very flexible. over the last years, nuclear power operation was made much more flexible, but there is increased wear and tear. And so that comes at a cost. And still, it's not the most flexible alternative to renewables. When there is no wind and no solar, nuclear might not be the best backup capacity. And nuclear is in some sense low cost because of the high capacity factor, the many operating hours a year. But that only applies when you need the base load. When you give priority to renewables, and if you have plenty of renewables, there will be times when nuclear is not necessary or not the first dispatch technology. And that reduces the running hours of nuclear and makes nuclear more expensive than it used to be.
Mm. Yes, no, I think that is very true. That is from Ying Zhao. For Chinese government, sometimes energy security is the most important. That was a question or a remark here.
That's one of the trade-offs. I showed the energy trilemma. And so we all want to have a secure energy supply system that is resilient, shock resilient, but also secure. Now, if we redesign and rebuild our energy systems, I see a high chance that something will go wrong because we will leave the well-established system on which we could build and trust for decades. And now we enter kind of an adventurous time, redesigning, rebuilding.
What do you say about the new EU? The EU want to put hydropower as being non-sustainable. And we have one source that is very good for balancing the variable renewables. What do you say about that? Is it, are they crazy, the guys down in Brussels, or what?
No, I think pump storage has been an extremely important element. Take the Switzerland. They have a few nuclear power plants and the rest is all hydropower. So they had a fossil-free system for decades at the price that they accepted nuclear power. Now they want to phase them out and they are desperate to find a solution. There is an extreme pressure because they don't want fossil, they want to get rid of nuclear, and all they're left with is hydropower and very little new renewables. There's a lot of opposition in terms of building wind parks and installations of photovoltaic plants because of the landscape.
But why does the EU down in Brussels want to ban hydropower?
I'm not aware of that ban.
There is a proposal that hydropower should not be considered being sustainable energy production in the future. It's not a decision yet, but it's a proposal.
As far as I know, there are issues about the ecological footprint. Every energy technology has an ecological footprint, and we should compare them with each other and in combination. And then I see that smaller scale hydropower has a proportionally higher ecological footprint, say large scale hydropower. And in Switzerland and Austria, they just managed to upgrade the existing systems. And then you have a relatively minor additional impact on the environment, but you can enhance the power production, the capacity and the production that way. By installing the state of the art and maybe making the dams a bit higher than they were. And in the end, in Switzerland, we suffer a lot from melting glaciers. That's already climate change ongoing, which makes power operations more expensive.
Professor Yen, you had a...
No, I just look at the time.
Yes, perhaps we should stop and thank you very, very much. It was a very interesting presentation. It's a very interesting subject, and thank you for the good discussion afterwards.